Okay, here we are, guys. We are still waiting for some people. Peter is not here yet. He's coming in a few minutes, I think. I hope. Let me just check. Okay. Then 3 minutes and we start, huh?
Okay.
Giorgio, what is the link to the YouTube?
I'll give it to you in a second. I'll send it to you in the chat.
Thank you.
Okay, Phil, just okay. If I click to some of the picture, the system shows. How can I show them?
So every person has this little thing here.
Yeah,
This is present to everyone.
that means
Mute. Present to everyone is the one.
okay, the one on the screen.
The one on the screen,
Okay,
yes.
okay, cool.
Mute is mute to mic. Eject is to put out of the.
Okay, cool. Understood. Very well, guys. I think we can start. I don't know how many people are already on the YouTube channel, but they can catch up with the. They will always be able to catch up with the YouTube link that we send weekly after the meeting. Thank you, everyone, to be here. Thank you very much for your participation to the forum, and thank you very much for the lecture that lectures that you're gonna deliver today. We're really looking forward to hear what you have to say, to listen to the materials that you prepared for us, and obviously we'll be here asking questions. I don't know how you organize your lecture, how you organize your time, your schedule. So I think I'm gonna give. Who starts? Just tell me, because I will put you on the screen.
Me.
Okay, 1 second. Leo, who starts?
Stefano will.
Stefano.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll put you on the screen. Welcome to the European Forum on Collective Intelligence, and we're here for you. Thank you very much. I'll put you on the screen. Is it working?
Okay, tell me if it's working.
Yeah, I'll tell you in a second. He's on the screen.
Unfortunately, it takes time to load the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you see a blank screen.
We still don't know. Just wait.
Yeah, it's loading.
It's loading. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's here. Thank you very much.
Okay.
You can start whenever you want. We're here for you.
Okay, I'm going right now. So, good evening, everybody. My name is Stefano Agostini. I'm from Rome. Today, I'm gonna present to you a paper named Virtual Community Informatics, a Review and Research Agenda, written by Lee Vogel-Limayan. As you probably see, I erased some words. I had to cut off some words because I had to cut off a part of the paper because you required 5 pages length. So I had to cut off, I think, two parts out of 3 of the paper. But the main part is there, which is a review of the virtual community definitions. The other parts were about possible classifications of virtual community and communities, and a review of the research agenda. I think that the majority of you don't have the same background I have, which is in communication sciences and sociology. So I'll do my best to introduce to you this topic, which is online communities. Before we start, I think it's important to say a few things, which is the first one. Of course, depending on how we describe society, our point of view changes, and also the way we see the phenomena we study. So, for instance, if we stress the hyper-industrialization and the tertiary, we will be talking about the post-industrial society. If we will be focusing on, don't know, the knowledge sector, we will be talking about the information society. But we will be focusing on the network as the structure of the society. And also, if we stress the information as a commodity, we will be talking about the network society. Very well described by Manuel Castells. And I'm saying that because I think that the theoretical context we use is very important when we use a phenomenon. In this case, I think that the network society is the best theoretical framework we can use. Combined with the network individualism written by Barry Wellman, which is a concept actually, it's not really a theoretical framework, even if he developed a kind of in recent years. Each one of them resonate to the other, so they quote each other. But it's important also to say that both of them don't come, I mean, the network society and the network individualism with the internet. Time was needed to see these phenomena evolve. So, for instance, about the network individualism, Barry Wellman very clearly stated that high transportation network infrastructure, and the telephone connection, like the I should talk about communication technology, and also the mobile phones and the internet, of course. They all occurred when we talk about network individualism that started from the 70s. And of course, the internet was a boost. I had to talk about online communities, but I'm talking about virtual communities. So it's important to say that they are labels, and there's no consensus over the label we use. But something must be said, I think. If we talk about online communities, it's like we are talking about something that, let's say, switch off when the network itself and the devices are switched off. When we talk about virtual communities, we are talking about something which continues to exist, let's say, to work, when the network and the devices we are using are switched off. And when we talk about digital communities, mainly we are referring to the information itself. Of course, in the last session, I don't remember the name of the guy, where was talking about a definition of collective intelligence, and he said that there is no consensus about a definition of collective intelligence. So I have to say it's the same, of course, about the concept community and the concept VC, of course. And this is the interesting part of this paper, which tries to address to this problem. Actually, the goal that the authors had was very ambitious, which was to provide a working definition of virtual community, which is to say, try to find an agreement about a working definition, not only a definition, a working definition. The paper has been written, it was written in 2003, so it's old, let's say. But I would say that it's old but good, because not so much has been written so far, and there are very intriguing things that have been written between 2004 and 2008. But anyway, many authors gave very good definitions until 2003. So the date is not a problem. And before we start, it's also important to say that virtual communities are not a brand new phenomenon. They came up many years ago, and we see here when. So at the end of the 60s. So it's not a recent phenomenon. On the left side, I thought to put the positive sides of the paper, and on the right, the negative sides. We can see what I said before. So the aim of the paper is very good. Nevertheless, some important things are missing, in my opinion, and few of them are that some important definitions are missing. If we have time, I can give you some of them. They put Jones in the literature, and a paper by written by Jones where he wrote about the virtual settlement, but there's no any. They don't refer to the virtual settlement written by Jones, and neither what Hillary said about the concept community, for instance, because Hillary in the 50s tried to classify more than 90 community definitions, and he found three main elements that were common in these definitions. And I see here that they didn't take into account what Hillary made, actually. So, and also the label which they use, the virtual community definition label, is not taken into account as problematic. We have also to think about the current context which is to say that virtual communities are also in our mobile phones, for instance, in our WhatsApp groups. So, of course, this paper is not very updated, but it's very good in my opinion. So this is the starting point of the paper, which is try to understand what a virtual community is. And they made a review, as I told you before, trying to find a working definition that could have a consensus. To do so, they put the main 9 definitions they found in a table and try to evaluate each one of them. I'm going to do it with you now. Actually, I used a little bit what they wrote, but they wrote a paper which is very short, so I try to say something more about it. In gray, you see the good things of the definitions I'm introducing to you. In red, the problematic elements. Let's start with this, where the definition given by Carver in 1999. Virtual communities are about aggregating people. People are drawn to virtual communities because they provide an engaging environment in which to connect with other people, sometimes only once, but more often in an ongoing series of interactions that create an atmosphere of trust and real insight. What I see here is that the focus of Carver is on aggregating people by interaction. And the reason why is the stay together. The reason why, I mean, of course, the reason why they meet there in a virtual community and stay together. Even if it's, you know, it's like rhetorical. I mean, we stay in a virtual community to stay together. It's not a real reason why. And I don't see any shared place, any reference to a shared place here. Why do I mention the shared place? Because if we talk about a virtual community, we should talk about a space where users are bonded together. And to do so, they need a shared place to post their messages, to share their messages. Because if they don't have a shared place where they put their contents, we could be talking about a group of people which exchange messages individually, which is something different. And of course, here, a problematic element of this definition is that they can meet only once, but more often in an ongoing series, blah, blah, blah. It's like, what if they meet just once? I don't see a virtual community if they meet just once, because we need ties in a community. Craig and Zimring gave a definition which is not a good definition of virtual community, in my opinion, because they define a virtual community as sense of community. The focus here is on the interaction, and we don't have a reason why they are together. And the shared place is missing as well. Ericsson in 1997 defined a virtual community as long-term, computer-mediated conversations amongst large groups. Here, the focus is on the communication, but we don't have a real reason why. The shared place is between the lines, because he wrote about a group. So hopefully he was thinking about a shared place. But anyway, what if we have a small group? Don't we have a virtual community? Because I think so. The fourth definition comes from Hagel and Armstrong, 1997. Virtual communities are computer-mediated spaces where there is a potential for an integration of content and communication with an emphasis on member-generated content. So here I see that the focus is on the online communication. The authors state, as I wrote you here below, member-generated content obviously refers to data, information, discussion, feelings. For me, it's not obvious. And then also that, I would say also that if there is a potential, it's very specific if we say that there is a potential. So we don't know if the integration of content and communication took place or not. And the common interest is written between the lines here in this definition, but it's there. Let's move on to the fifth definition from Hess. He wrote this definition in 1995. Virtual community is a community that spans time and geography, a community that supplements buildings and streets with personal computers and information superhighways. So I don't know if this is a working definition. Many things are missing, just like the reason why they're there. But anyway, a good thing from Hess is that he mentioned community. Because, for instance, Kramer, Zimring, and Agel and Armstrong didn't mention any word like member, persons. So I think it's important to mention that there are users or persons within a community. The sixth definition comes from Ho, Schraffel, and Chignell. It was written in 2000. For them, a virtual community is technologically mediated, persistent environment which supports multiple interaction styles, capability for real-time interaction, and multi-user engagement. So here we have multi-user engagement, which says that there are users, there is a shared place, because there is a multi-user engagement, there are not private messages. But the problem that I see here is that what if we have a community which uses walkie-talkie, which is to say radio transmitter and receiver, for who doesn't know what a walkie-talkie is. So they don't specifically define the tools that this community should use. We have a big mistake here, because the seventh definition, which for me it's the best one, comes from Reingold, not Howard. Howard is the name, Reingold is the surname. He is a very famous author and was the first one, I think, that was really into virtual communities. He wrote a book called The Reality of Virtual Communities, if I'm right. And he gives a very good definition here, because he defined a virtual community as social aggregations that emerge from the net when enough people carry on public discussion long enough with sufficient human feeling to form webs of personal relationships in cyberspace. So what I see here is that we have all the elements we need. So we have a group of persons or users, we have a shared online space, we have a computer-based information technology as the tool, we have a communication interaction, and we have a common interest. And also very important, there are ties between the persons, because he said that time is needed and long discussions are needed to develop a tie. So I think this is a good definition. Of course, enough, it's not very specific, but the main meaning is there. And what I see here is that calling one of the main authors by his name and missing important things gives us the idea that they wrote this paper very, very fast, missing something. And also because I read at the end that the authors don't have a vast background. They all come from information systems. So maybe this is one of the reasons, and also because the goal that they wanted to achieve was very ambitious, as I said at the beginning. Number 8, Johnson Raphael in 2000 defined virtual communities as virtual publics. They are symbolically delineated computer-mediated spaces whose existence is relatively transparent and open, that allows groups of individuals to attend and contribute to a similar set of computer-mediated interpersonal interactions. Here you can read the focus is about interaction of group of persons in a shared online space, which is very good. What is missing is the reason why they are there. Maybe the interaction, but anyway, as I told you before, it's not very specific. And then Roman Clark, in 1995, they wrote groups of people who communicate with each other via electronic media rather than face-to-face. Again, electronic media could be radio, transmitters, and receivers. And again, we don't know why they are there, sharing their time and ideas. What they did when the authors wanted to provide a working definition was putting all the main elements together, missing what I told you before, which could have been taken from Hillary, so from a sociological perspective. So we have here cyberspace, computer-based information technology, communication and interaction of participants, member-driven contents, relationship, and again, I wrote this, the common interest is between the lines because it was not very clear. So they came up with virtual community is a cyberspace supported by computer-based information technology, centered upon communication and interaction of participants to generate member-driven contents, resulting in a relationship being built. Here, they recuperate what our Reingold wrote about the ties, you know. So here you can read relationship being built, so there is a tie. I highlighted cyberspace in red because actually it doesn't make sense in scientific terms. Like Van Dijk wrote about it, the cyberspace was taken from a novel written by William Gibson, a fiction author, so it's not very scientific. Again, these are the things that are missing, in my opinion, about this working definition. And what I think, this is other stuff. If we want to go, if we want to talk about also the classification of virtual communities, but what is important, I think, is that defining a virtual community is very important. What a virtual community is, because when we when we make a case selection for our case studies, for instance, it's very important to know what we want to search for. If we define not very specifically what the object of our study, we are going to have problems. Just to let you know, in this paper, at the end, they made a survey about 300 websites that they wanted to classify as virtual communities. And I was asking to myself, how can they do it if they don't have a real working definition, in my opinion, for virtual communities? And just to let you know, for my PhD thesis, I had to elaborate a virtual community definition that could fit the reality I was going to study. So definitions are good on a theoretical level, but when we are talking about working definition, they should work also on the empirical level. Before I end with this presentation, I want to reply to Matilde, who kindly asked me what are the tools currently adopted in virtual communities, especially with the mobile phones. Well, Matilde, I don't know. I mean, we should take into account that, of course, technology is developing very fast, but we don't know also what the users are doing within these virtual communities. For instance, if we have a shared place, it's very possible that a minority of the main group is communicating in another virtual community, maybe on a WhatsApp group. And so it's for me, it's more interesting to understand the communication flow within a virtual community. And about the tools, well, I don't know. I mean, they can use whatever they want to use. I investigated 2 virtual communities that use the mailing list, and they are still using the mailing list because for their purposes it works perfect. So it's good to take a look about what's new, but also about what's going on actually in reality, which is not always what is very, very new. So I finished my presentation. I think I can give you the screen. Let me know if you can, if you receive the screen.
Okay.
I have a question for you, Stefano, if you want. I was just wondering, there's a lot of emphasis in what you're saying on the importance of a shared space.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, why do you think that is so important, and why is it necessary to have a shared space? Could the community not be defined simply by having, I don't know, sufficient interactions among the group, even if it's on an individual basis?
Well, because
Stefano, could you please turn on your video?
Yes.
Because there's something strange.
Working?
We can't see you.
I think you have to turn off the shared screen.
Yeah, you should turn on the shared screen.
I tried to do it. I tried to do it. I mean, is it fine now?
No. Yes. Now it's
fine. Okay. Okay. I'll tell you why. Because when we define a community, like Hillary said, it's very important that there must be a place where the community lives. And if we are online in a virtual place, anyway, we need a place. Because if we exchange personal messages, we are not communicating to everybody, which is what we should do when we are talking about a virtual community. I know what you are thinking about now. I mean, we are in a society, so we don't meet each one of us, even in a small village. But a shared place is necessary not only because it's important to see the relationship within the group, but also to monitoring the group. And it's important also to know what the borders are of this space. That's why I said before, it's very interesting to study the flow of the communication. And that's why I really believe in qualitative studies, because if we only make an ethnography, which is an observation online, it's not enough for many reasons, and I don't have time to explain all the reasons why, but in particular, regarding to your question, because we don't know what they are doing behind us. I mean, are they exchanging SMS or WhatsApp messages or emails? So I think it's very important to establish the borders, and of course we need a shared place to define a group, a community, because if we need to establish some ties within the community, we need to give the possibility for everybody to communicate, to establish a tie. I don't know if I replied to your questions.
No, I think you have. Thank you.
And I don't know if Matilde is satisfied with my reply.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was super interesting and super knowledgeable, especially because we work on like virtual communities, and as for all these new concepts, it's always hard to like define them in a really precise way. Sometimes each author gives his own definition, gives his own working definition, and uses it without even considering the other options. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Who's next?
I am.
You are. Okay, I'll put you on the screen.
Thank you. I'll share my screen so we can look at the presentation.
You should be on. Can we see Leonardo?
Do you have to... Let me see if there's this... Can you see the screen now or no?
Yep.
You see my presentation? Can you see it or not? Hello?
Yeah,
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So in my presentation, I'm gonna talk a little bit about complex networks and the reason why I think they are an interesting and important literature to explore from somebody interested in collective intelligence. So the study of complex networks really comes from two main sources. The first is the study of complex systems, and the second is actually sociology, as many of the initial studies on networks were, of course, done on social networks to understand the relationship between people inside communities and things like this. However, when we talk about complex systems, it is fairly difficult to define precisely what a complex system is. And in particular, it's difficult to distinguish between what we could call a complicated system and a complex system. However, in general, we can sort of divide between the two by saying that a complex system is a system which, in essence, is more than the sum of its parts. So, to make an example, in the economy, for example, you have very simple agents. That is, all the people engaging within the economy. That create a system which is much more complex than the single behavior. So the economic system experiences crashes, experiences inflation, bubbles, and all these kind of behavior that you could not really explain by directly observing a single individual. But it's rather in the interaction between these individuals that the behaviors are established. And therefore, we can see that we have a twofold system in which you have the single individual behavior and the interaction, and these two put together, bring and make essentially create what we could call emergent behaviors for the system as a whole. In particular, the importance of networks is therefore clear, as networks sort of try to establish the connection between the parts of the system and what is the relationship between the dynamics and the topology of the system. So why is this important for collective intelligence? Well, we can see that collective intelligence, in a sense, is a special property of some complex system, right? It is an emergent behavior that is a group of interacting agents that collectively behave in an intelligent way. And this is, of course, a system in which the system behaves more as a sum of its parts. As we have seen in some presentations last week, the group intelligence is more than the intelligence of the single individuals. And this is effectively what an example of a complex system. I think that in particular, complex network theory provides very powerful tools that we can use in order to deepen our understanding of these systems, especially when the systems become increasingly large, and therefore mapping between the various interactions becomes difficult. So I have, in my paper that I'm presenting is effectively a review, and I will be looking at initially some of the topological properties of these networks, of real-world networks. I'll just briefly, for those who don't know, the topology is effectively a fancy word to say the structure of the network. So what kind of in connections do we have? Do we have a lot of nodes, meaning agents connected to many different nodes, or is it a few nodes connecting to all the nodes, or all the nodes connected to each other? And one of the first theories about how networks behaved was the sort of a completely random network in which every single node has equal probability to connect to all other nodes. However, if you look at how the properties of these networks, they really do not match the empirical evidence that we have about real networks, such as the World Wide Web, metabolic networks, social networks. There are things like this. So instead, one property that we observe is the scale-free property. And scale-free property effectively means that the degree distribution obeys a power law. So what does this mean? It means that in real networks, there are very few nodes which are connected to many nodes, and there are many nodes which are connected only to a few nodes. And this distribution is observed pretty much in any network that you see in real life. And it is a property that has been theorized that could be due to what is called preferential attachment. So a node tends to prefer to connect itself to nodes which already are connected to many other nodes. This in turn creates a system in which the nodes that have already a lot of nodes tend to get a lot of connections towards them, but they only connect to maybe a few of the other big nodes. An example of this can be seen, for example, in websites. You know, if you're a very important website, a lot of other websites will connect to you, meaning that you will have small websites with very few connections through them that connect to some central hubs. Another interesting property is the small work property, which effectively says that the distance between any two nodes, if you take any two nodes at random, the distance is very small. And small is, of course, relative to the number of nodes you have in the network. And this property is important because it's not a trivial property. You know, it's not what you would expect in a random network, but it's something that is connected to scale-free as well, because if you have a lot of central hubs, this means that the distance between any two hubs is very small. And if you think about this, this is very interesting to see when you talk about, for example, infrastructure systems. If you see the connection, for example, between airports, you will see that you have some airports that are, if you want to move between any two airports, you can generally just have one or two connections only. You don't need many connections. And that's because you have some central hubs which connect to many, to many networks. And therefore, if you are if you connect to the hub, you can then move to any of the other hubs, and then you get to your destination. Finally, there is high clustering in real networks. And high clustering is particularly important because effectively it says that nodes tend to be connected between what we can call clusters, or effectively communities of networks, which have a lot of nodes, a lot of connections between each other, but not many towards other nodes that are external to the group. And we will see that these properties are properties that are common between networks, not all, but many of the networks we observe in the real world. And it's important to note this because one of the aims of complex network theory is to establish, common rules that govern dynamics of all networks that we can observe. I will now talk a little bit about community structure. I thought this was interesting because of the previous presentation, we talked about, Stefano talked about the virtual communities, and I thought it'd be interesting to see what the complex network theory has done to discuss in a more, if you want, quantitative manner how to define a community. And this has a very important, it's a very important principle that of communities, because it relates as well to the dynamics. In general, we understand that nodes that are connected to each other usually represent in the real system that we're understanding, that we're measuring, maybe nodes that behave in a similar way, or maybe nodes that are connected in a similar way, that have some principle that governs them. And we will see some examples later on. In particular, I wanted to discuss about a approach by one of the papers that I've cited, which is by Girvan and Newman, in which the community is found using a measure of betweenness centrality. What does this mean? It is effectively a measure of how many of the shortest paths between two nodes pass through a particular node or edge. The node, of course, is the link, while it's the vertex, whilst the edge is the connection between the nodes. So what are we measuring with this? We're measuring how important is that particular connection in connecting two different groups of nodes. If, for example, if there is if you have two groups of nodes which are very connected to each other and only have one link between the two groups, you can see already that a lot of the shortest paths will pass through that particular edge, meaning that if you remove that edge, you would separate completely the two groups. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to find the edges, so the connections between groups that really are connect large groups of nodes. And effectively what we do is we find the communities by removing the edges that are most important, that are most central. And if we do so, we get the graphs like the ones we've done before, you can see below. So we have two graphs. One on the left is the original graph, where you can see the various nodes and the connections between them. And on the right, you have what would happen if you started removing one edge at a time, what connections would be left. So if you start from the top, you can see if you remove the most central one, you would split the group in two. If you remove the next top ones, you would split the group in 4 groups, and so on. And you can see, and effectively this provides a method for identifying the community. And this is a particularly interesting example because this was a study done by Zachary, in which he observed throughout a period of time the members of a karate club, and mapped the relationships between these people to understand, who was connected to whom by friendship, by other relations. And if we apply the algorithm that I described before to find the communities, we can find that you can easily identify the two groups, the one in light gray and the one in white. And these two groups are actually very interesting because in reality, this group at a certain point the karate club split in 2 different clubs because there was some divergence of opinion between 2 members of the club. And the 2 communities that we identified nearly exactly map the people that went into one club into the other club. So we can see there's a strong relationship between this community finding algorithm and actually how the communities identified themselves. So we were able to predict how the group would split by just mapping the relationship between them and using a centrality measure to find the 2 possible structures. Another interesting approach is instead the one by Guimera and Amaral. And I think they've used a similar approach by Girvan in finding communities, but they've done a step more, which was describing the functions that nodes play within a community. And they identified 7 different functions. And they mapped them using 2 different measures. So they first identify the communities or groups or clusters, as you want to call them, using an algorithm similar to the one described before. And then they map each node according to 2 criteria. One is the within module degree, and the other is the participation coefficient. Effectively, there are two measures of within module degree, or Z-score, is a measure of connection within the group. So how connected is the node to members of its own group? Whilst the participation coefficient is a measure of how well connected is the group to members of other groups. So effectively, the participation coefficient is 0 when a node is connected only to members of its own group, and it's 1 when it's uniformly distributed between members of all groups. Okay, and we can see, therefore, we can map into 7 groups. This is the 7 functions. The ultra-peripheral nodes are nodes that are pretty much only connected to members of its own group. But they're not very connected. They're very peripheral nodes. They don't play a much important role. Peripheral nodes are nodes which are connected to mostly its own group, and not particularly to other groups, but are still, not very connected. They don't have many connections. Then you have non-hub connector nodes, which are nodes which have still not very many connections, but they have a lot more towards groups outside their own. So they have a connecting function. You then have non-hub kinless nodes, which effectively saying that these are nodes which have very few connections, and they tend to connect pretty much at random between its group and other groups. They're not very much connected more to the group than to other nodes. You then have nodes that are more connected, and we can see 3 categories here. The provincial hubs, which are hubs which have a lot of connections but are not connected much to the outside of the group. You have connector hubs, which are groups that are nodes that are much connected to both inside the group and outside the group. And finally, you have the kinless hubs. These are nodes which have a lot of connections, and these connections are pretty much uniformly distributed between inside the group and outside the group. So why is this important? Well, this was important because this study was actually applied to the study of metabolic networks in a lot of different biological, in different organisms. And I'm afraid I'm not expert on these networks. However, what was interesting was that using the algorithm that we described before and these functions, they managed to create a map like this of the metabolic network. And effectively, what this map is showing is that they were able to see that certain molecules were particularly had particular roles in connecting different groups of molecules that had similar, structure. Effectively, if you see the various colors of these circles, each circle represents a group of these metabolites, and you can see that the majority of these groups tend to have a single function. They tend to relate to a particular function. So either the amino acids, the carbohydrate metabolism. There are different lipid metabolism. They effectively tend to have a specific function, and there are particular molecules that are particularly important in connecting these. And one of the things that they found in the study was that the molecules that connected these hubs, these groups, they tended to be more common across different species, meaning that evolution, they are more evolutionarily important across species, and they not tend to be replaced within the species. But I think it shows how powerful, the description of communities in graphs can be, because it can help you understand exactly how different molecules play, what role different molecules play within a complex network such as this one. But in general, the principle that we described before could be applied to any such network, to any network of any kind. A last thing that I want to mention, and I've kept my presentation brief because I maybe wanted to discuss more than to present, was that of information processing on networks. So far, what I've described is effectively a static approach to networks in which the network does not change. The network is already a map of the information we have available about the system. However, in many cases, networks are they perform operations, they spread, they measure the information of spreading, they make computations and things like this. And in the review that I posted, they essentially propose 4 principles that we can see across in various examples of information processing on networks, which is very interesting for collective intelligence. And these 4 principles are that the global information is encoded as statistics and dynamics of patterns over system component. What does this mean? Well, effectively, what it means is that information in these systems that are very decentralized is not organized in a simple way, but rather is encoded in the way that these various agents or various nodes interact between each other. And the patterns that emerge between this interaction is what actually encode the information. And because this information is in these patterns, and these patterns are probabilistic in nature, it is clear that randomness and probabilities are essential to information processing on networks. Another interesting thing, which has come from especially the study of ants, is that but also the natural system, is that these systems tend to carry out a parallel search for all possibilities. For example, when ants, when they were looking for food, they try different possibilities. Ants pretty much search at random, but when they find something, when they go back towards the nest, they leave a trail of a particular scent that the other ants can follow. And this sort of creates a reinforcement. When other ants follow the same path, the scent becomes stronger and more ants will go through. But effectively what they've initially done is they've searched parallelly for all possibilities, and then they reinforce the possibility that they found. This is one of the ways in which information is processed in networks. And the last thing, which I think is particularly interesting, is that these systems are hierarchical in nature. There are different layers of structure. You can talk about the microscopic structure, which is the single agent structure, and then you have the mesoscopic structure, which is the communities. Big groups of these nodes and how they work together. And on the last level, you have the macroscopic level, where you see the system as a whole. And one would expect, in general, sort of for causality to go from the microscopic to the mesoscopic to the macroscopic. But this is not in general true. In actual fact, the structures that are created at the mesoscopic and microscopic level can actually affect the microscopic behaviors. So, for example, in the ant example, the network of scent that is being created affects the decision of the single ant. So there is an interplay between different hierarchies, and there is both a bottom-up causality, but also a top-down causality, which is something which is very interesting. So in conclusion, what is this? Why is this important for collective intelligence? Well, what sort of network science is trying to tell us is that systems that have similar behaviors tend to have similar structural properties. So if collective intelligence can be studied from a structural point of view, then we expect to find common structural properties between all CI systems that could be interesting to explore. What kind of topology does a group that works well have? If we have two groups, one is very efficient and one is very inefficient, what is the difference between the topology of these two systems? That is something that could be interesting and worth analyzing. The community structure is also important, because when we have systems composed of very few people or very few agents, this is not particularly difficult to analyze the interactions. But when we have a lot of when we have groups of maybe millions of interacting agents, then suddenly the structure, the communities, is really important in determining the behaviors. And finally, as collective intelligence systems effectively process information and complete tasks and certain things, if we understand how information is processed by networks, that is effectively the same as understanding how a collective intelligence system can work. Okay, this is it.
Thank you very much. I have a question.
Yes, let me just.
Yeah.
Is it okay now?
Yeah. No. Okay. Yeah. Now it's loading. Yeah.
Okay. You should see me as well.
I have a couple of questions for you. Thank you very much. It was really, really knowledgeable, really, really useful, especially for what I'm studying now. So thank you. And my two questions are, the first one is whether there is any relevant results on how what kind of structures can facilitate or improve the quality of the communications inside a community. So what I'm trying to ask is whether there is some formalized result about how the structure influences the spread of information inside a community. So is there any key result that we have, anything that we can use practically in building up our networks, our communities?
Yes, there is actually, and I think it's maybe less obvious, but effectively there's been a lot of studies about epidemic spreading, how diseases spread over a network of people. So if you have a community of different people that see each other regularly, why does this, why certain communities are more affected by diseases than others, and how fast does the disease spread in different topologies of the networks. So if you change the name of disease to information or something else, then yes, you can just apply the same results. Now, I don't know exactly the results myself at the moment. I've read it only briefly, so I cannot tell you more than this. But if you want, I can give you a review of these things. I can definitely find it. Thank
you very much. It would be cool, because what I was thinking is that if people had a more in-depth knowledge about how to build their networks, how to manage how to place themselves inside their networks, that would sharply dramatically increase their power, their ability to influence the group and to make a positive change inside the group. Well,
one thing that it was actually that I can say is that the small world property that I was talking about, the fact that the minimum distance, so the average distance is very small between two nodes. That is one of the properties that shows, the effectiveness of real world networks. You have to, one of the reasons why these networks are very similar, even though they have very different purposes, is because they all tend to try to efficiently absolve some purpose, right? And this sort of process of optimization, if you want, tends to have, a very similar structure in the end. And the small world property is saying that, you have you only need very few connections to get to the other person you want to talk. And if you think about it, this is, have you ever heard of the sort of 6 degrees of separation experiment, right? Where they tested that you only need, 6 people to get to any person in the world. So if I talk to a friend, to a friend, and a friend, and a friend, I can talk to anybody in the world as long as I have 6 people between me and him. And this is effectively a small world property. This is what we mean, is that if, for example, you're a researcher and you want to find another researcher, you don't need to know many researchers, because a researcher will know another researcher that will know another researcher. So there is already a certain efficiency in this. And the other thing is, when I was describing the functional groups, right, so the different functions that different nodes have, it is clear that there are certain functions that are very important. There are certain nodes that tend to, have a lot of connection within the group, but there are also the nodes that connect outside the group, right? These are sort of hubs that really make sort of the connection between the groups. So of course, if you are one of those nodes in a social network, you're a very important node. That would mean, for example, the friend that everybody knows, but not only the friend that everybody knows in your group, but the friend that everybody knows in the whole city, right? I'm sure that you have a friend that everybody knows, that every time you talk to him, you realize, but he also knows this person that I also know through another group of people, right? And that's what we're talking about. That's the person we are referring to.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think there are certain rules about how you can structure things, but there are two things. I think in general, when the studies they've done on epidemic spreading were mostly concentrated on sort of robustness to contagion and yes, sort of these kind of things. So I think you can find something there that could be interesting.
Okay, I see. Thank you very much. And the second question is whether you think that these sort of properties that you describe stem automatically from the interaction between the agents of the group, or they are the direct effect of the structure of the rules that the community gave itself.
I'm not sure if I really understood the question. So you're saying if the properties of the network are a result of the way that the agents interact, or vice versa? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'll try to reword the question. What I was trying to ask is whether you think that, if there is any evidence that explains whether the three properties that characterize most of the networks, the real networks that we see all around us, are the effect of a structuring like a structuring process brought about consciously and systematically, or they are these properties are the result of a human way of of a human way of being in the world. So what I was trying to say is, if you think that these three properties are invariant on the system, they stem out from, or whether they are the result of how, for example, Western societies, Western communities have learned to structure their communities, their networks.
Well, I mean, first of all, these properties are not common just to human networks, but to all sorts of networks, even networks of molecules inside the body. So this is definitely not something to do with culture. This is a more fundamental point. And in general, there's of course debate about exactly what brings about, because you have to understand this, or whenever you try to put together different disciplines and have a very multidisciplinary approach and finding rules that govern all systems, you're of course not gonna be doing a very good job, right? Because every system has its own peculiarities that must be taken into account. However, there are certain things that are in common, and in particular is that most networks are established through an evolutionary approach, right? The networks are not they don't exist a priori, right? They are built, and they're built in time. So in general, what we expect is that there to be an evolutionary rule that determines these characteristics. And these evolutionary rules have to do with survival, efficiency. They have to do with effectively evolutionary principles, adaptive principles. And in general, you can see that sort of the properties that we described make a lot of sense, right? They are different. It's what you would expect, effectively. If you have a network that is evolving, you expect a new link to connect to a link that has a lot of connections rather than a link that has few connections. And this is what I was talking about when I was talking about preferential attachment. This is sort of what was proposed as the main mechanism. If you follow this simple rule, many of the other properties follow as a consequence. Now, is this the rule that governs everyone, every system? We don't really know. I mean, it's not very clear, but it might have in every single system have something similar that determines this evolutionary behavior. There might be a question of efficiency, maybe. You know, if you're connected to a hub that is connected to many other things, you have a better connection with the whole system rather than, you know, to make again the example of the World Wide Web. If you connect to a website, if you link to a website is very important, you know, that gives you a lot more credibility than if you link to a website that nobody knows, right? So you're much more likely to connect to important websites than to connect to very unknown websites, right? And this sort of is what generates this structure.
Okay.
But I wouldn't say it's so it's design in a sense of there is an evolutionary design, but not like a design from above, right? These are all structures that emerge by themselves. There's no coordinated effort to construct these things.
Mm-hmm. Because sometimes I have the impression that this kind of rules that we describe and that should govern the communities we are in are more the result of a conscious effort or of the structure, the technologies that allows those interactions instead of the result of natural evolutionary process that should at the end should always lead to the same shape of community. I mean, I don't think that it's just a matter of time or of how people interact. Sometimes, in my opinion, especially in human networks and human communities, there is conscious or unconscious designing effort behind this kind of rules that we have described.
Well, I guess there can be in certain cases, but I don't see, for example, in a sort of take, for example, the social network such as Facebook, right? The connection of friendships in Facebook, right? There is no rule that governs. There's no design. You decide. Every single person decides to whom they connect, right? And yet we still see the sort of same behavior, right? So I think, if anything, what is maybe possible is that the technology that we use or the particular dynamics of the system can have an impact on the topology. I think that's for sure. But I think if there is a design from above, then it really isn't a good example of a complex system, right? Because then it's designed. It's not sort of spontaneous and emergent.
Okay. Thank you very much. Really, really, really cool, really informative.
I think maybe Matilde had a question.
Okay. Matilde, do you have a question? You can't.
No. I just hope you can hear me now.
Yes, we can.
I'm sorry, I missed most of Leonardo's presentation because I was fighting with my microphone, but I made it.
I'm sorry about that.
No, I will watch it. Thank you. Luckily, we got YouTube.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, I'll give you the word. I'll put you on the screen, okay? Matilde, welcome to the European Forum on Collective Intelligence.
Thank you. Right, start sharing my screen with you, right? Okay. Now I share my screen and I pass over to my presentation, which was on Google Docs. So when we first met with Stefano and Leonardo, some of us were at a loss for what we were going to say. So we decided that Stefano was going to have this general introduction, Leonardo was going to speak about what are complex networks, and I was going to bring some cases. Being a librarian, my case is the information, starting on the assumption intelligence needs collective critical thinking, or what sort of intelligence are we building? And for that reason, I did some research, and I found a very recent, since the limit of the 5 pages obliges to find quite short papers or so, I found an interesting a paper on the latest science issue, the science of fake news. Well, most of the issue actually is dedicated to that. And so I decided to start with that one, because one of the first statements was this: addressing fake news requires a multidisciplinary effort. And so we are doing a multidisciplinary effort in this forum. Therefore, I thought, okay, this is it. Screen?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, because I can only see the shared screen now. Right. So let's start from the definitions before. What is fake news? According to the article, it is information that mimics news media content in form, but not in organizational process or intent. To a librarian, talking about organizational process and form is quite clear. Maybe not to the lay public. But the idea, the interesting thing behind the article, or what I would like to underline, is that they speak about news media content. They apply today. And they are saying that the form might be similar, but the process behind it is different. Actually, fake news belongs to the sphere of post-truth, which was Oxford Dictionary Word of the Year for 2017 after the 2016 presidential election. But it is not so new, because it dates back to the donation of Constantine, is a very, very old piece of fake news. And we know the Pope built his over that. So it works. Sometimes fake news can really, even if it's fake. In the article, they refer to fake news as what happened after World War I and the Second. It is the propaganda used, and they refer to the story of how, after that, media industry and media producers decided to give themselves a sort of ethical code and follow certain rules. Because the spread of fake news is facilitated by many different facts. We saw in 2016 the campaign, and the Brexit campaign brought a lot of disinformation around, which led to a drop in trust in the media. We know that homogeneous social networks attract a mass to fake news, because when we find people, we can recognize ourselves in the values and the things that we hear, we tend to believe them. The article states there's very little research and few scientific answers on the spread of fake news and their impact on individuals. Well, I think it should be clarified, because that I would say there is quite some research about it. Anyway, what they point out is that much fake news is also spread by bots. That is 9 to 15% of Twitter accounts, 16 million accounts in Facebook are bots. So what can be done? There are 2 different lines proposed. One is empowering individuals, and the other one is preventing exposure of individuals through changes in the structure in the network. If we want to empower individuals, there are actually 2 ways. One would be making available a series of fact-checking websites and working through education. The first is done through schools, libraries, and other institutions which are already on the territory and can work on the population. Fact-checking websites, well, there are a lot of them. The article points to some US-based, of course. I put here some hints which can be more useful from a European or Italian point of view. StopFake.org especially is very interesting, because it was born in Ukraine Ukraine, funded to counterfeit the Russian misinformation on Ukraine, and now it has contents in many different languages, and it's grown to a real community with a lot of useful tips and information about information. They're known to most people here. Biblioverifica.cloud is a recently started experiment by some colleagues, some librarians at the University Tor Vergata, and ISS Salute was set up by the Istituto, by the health institution, and it deals with fake news about health issues. Okay, how can we work on the structure? On the structure, with the same way, the same problems, threats for the structure are also opportunities, because algorithms and bots can also emphasize quality information. They could lead to minimizing both impact, and they could enhance quality contents, and be careful to point out to us, the users, when the trending is caused by other bots' devices. But these both ways against fake news, let's say empowering individuals and working on structure, have got also drawbacks. Because fact-checking, we should assume that people want to check facts. And it is not always so, because communities, people feel they belong to community values, their beliefs are conditioned by them, they desire to believe that what they desire is true. They have got their biases. For example, if I read that Mr. Trump has said something unconventional, I will tend to believe it. I will not go and check it because I am biased in his disfavor. So another thing is that if we keep on repeating fake news, it becomes familiar, and studies show that trust is put in familiar information. From the educational point of view, well, there's a great need for standardization. The EU DigComp is a framework, a European framework, which describes digital competencies, also regarding the skills, the abilities to discern and use information carefully. It's a very nice framework, but something like that should be really prepared and used in some way also in all schools, etc. And that's a big challenge. On the other hand, if we use algorithms and bots, again, well, done, for example, by stakeholders such as platforms like Facebook. They did a lot of research on that, says the article, but it's difficult to review that research. It's kept to themselves, and they are not clear as to what methods they use, etc. So it's difficult to peer review that. On the other hand, governments trying to limit somehow the access to information, preventing misinformation spread, well, it raises ethical issues. I don't think I need to explain. The libraries work through IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations. Among library missions, there's not just the preservation of the cultural heritage, but also the fact that libraries tend to put people in touch with the information they need. Therefore, they work for literacy, numeracy, digital and media literacy as well. And IFLA is among the organizations, the stakeholders that sit at the table writing the Millennium Development Goals 2030. This is the infographic they they created for a campaign, and which is available on the IFLA website, and it's been translated into 30 languages. It might be a nice tool, but again, people want, we must assume people want to use the tool. So the only way against fake news is promoting interdisciplinary research. And we need to do that because we need to redesign the information ecosystem in the 21st century, says still the article, because the media, which agreed to spread news basing on ethical principles, have got a lot of contenders now on the web which don't follow the same rules. So the information ecosystem is changing and must be redesigned. The article came to this point, but I added something more. First of all, some considerations on what happens when we go ahead to using business models. We've seen the recent facts regarding Facebook and the carelessness which Facebook treated our data. And another part of the world of information, which is the academic information. In the academic world, the world we move into, academic publications move between open access, institutional repositories, copyright issues. Well, let's see some of these things. I wanted to point them out being a librarian, but I think not everything that happens with and to academic information is widely known to the public, and so some awareness is needed. We know there's an open access movement, which in 2003 brought to the signing of 3 declarations, but which started much has given the world 3 wonderful open access repositories, Archive, ERIC, and PubMed. And among the others, there might be others, but these are, I think, the 3 most worth mentioning. We know the open access has got 2 ways, the gold and the green. Gold is defined what is chosen by the so-called open access journals, where the authors may have to pay a fee for the publication because there are really no costs. And a directory of this journal is available on the oaj.org. And the green open access, which is the way chosen by most of our institutional repositories, where researchers are allowed to deposit on the repositories a different format from the one which they actually publish. It could be a preprint, a postprint, or something. So the publishers grant the right to publish our publications in our institutional repository under certain conditions, which are defined as licenses under sherpa.ac.uk, or are very often found in our repositories. But it is necessary to publish. This is not a small problem. In our small community here and in the academic community, the research assessment is the key to success, to proceeding in career, advancing not just personally, but also institutionally. Because we know the money goes to our institutions also based on the quantity of research. This is why I was wondering, the more the clearer, it's low. How is research assessed and measured? We know that a lot of research is measured through metrics as H-index, impact factor, but a lot of debate is being going on as to they are guarantees of good science or not. Also because there are some areas, such as humanities, which are misrepresented, let's say, in these scenarios on databases such as Scopus and Web of Science. And then there is another problem. The academic community tends to sharing, because we know that sharing is good. We have discussed it here today, also during our previous meetings. But there are copyright issues. As I said before, when an article is published with the publisher has got its saying on what we can do with that material. Here, I would like to make a small distinction, because in the UK and in the US, according to legislation, the researchers and professors working for universities are considered to be sponsored directly by public money. Instead, in Italy, it is not always the case. This is not the case, because only projects which are specially sponsored by public money, so this whole progetti di ricerca with special funds, etc., are considered to be sponsored by public money, therefore must be open access. This is just a small reminder for those of you who might find it useful of the many licenses the range of licenses that go from public domain to you can't do anything with my paper. licenses. There are various different degrees. So what can we when I was thinking of these things, I started wondering if we were allowed to upload on Drive, for example, the articles that we are sharing, like the one from Science that I uploaded, or if there's a copyright infringement. And the answer is, if I look at the license for Science Mag, that are used by non-commercial institutions with an active institutional license to science for purely internal non-commercial research purposes. And with internal, they speak of the network, and the network, the secure network, is defined as it must be only accessible to authorized users approved by the licensee. So guys, I'm sorry, but we're breaking the law here by sharing these things. Of course, the problem is small. We are a small community, and as you know, you are able to obtain also from the through the discovery tools and electronic resources made available by your library. This is the case of La Sapienza, also from home, but every university has got this sort of services nowadays. But then, when we publish with someone, what do? Can we share it? Can we share the copy of our art paper or not? Or do we have to become copyright experts? Can we exchange papers? Well, we don't need to become copyright experts because we have the institution behind us. The institutional repository has got a lot of information, plenty of information. There are librarians and there are legal experts at universities. But I wanted to bring to you the case of a researcher who I've been told, is very, very good at contracting with publishers to have his works open access on his repository. This is Paolo Borsa from the University of Milan, and this is he has got about 100 contributions on his institutional repository, which are open. Most of them are open access. I think 97 of them are open access. This is where his publications went in the world, and this is the total number of the downloads of his papers divided by continent. Then, if I tell you that this researcher field of interest is Dante studies Italian literature, you can appreciate that probably, well, it's not the field which is mostly frequented, etc. It might be worth taking a look at copyright issues and making more of our research freely and clearly and legally available. But research communities use a lot of other tools. They use, for example, ResearchGate, academia. I am on both of them. I just love them. Altmetric, which can be, okay, which is a tool. You might know some others. I just like them. They give you qualitative data, they give you metrics, they give you a lot of information. But there are some things not everyone is aware of. That, first of all, we may publish anything technically on academia, like we were able to publish on our Drive. The problem is that if we infringe copyright, we are held personally liable. It's not the institution as when we publish in the institutional repository. They are owned by private corporations, and so probably the interest of the private corporations is to make their own interests and not ours to make money out of that. They are not interested in preservation. So they might disappear tomorrow with our data, also all our likes and all our sharing, etc. Bots and fake profiles can be found on these networks. Even if some control is in place, I recently received notice that academia suspected that my profile was a bot, because it was a fake, because I hadn't used it for a long time and because it was simply connected to a personal Google account. So I'm glad they did, but still they are there is some control, but still these things happen. And then we have to wonder what they do with our data, because we don't know. We might have read the license the first time, but we know conditions and terms change all the time. So to make a long story short, If we want to develop collective intelligence, we need reliable information. And the format and the organization of the information influences the way it is used in large communities. So it is necessary to use critical thinking to navigate the digital world. And awareness is needed both at a personal, individual, general, public, and at an academic level in academic communities. Regarding the science article, it relates fake news to the media world only. I said it before. I think it would benefit from a confrontation with collective intelligence communities, because though they foster an interdisciplinary confrontation, I read most of the authors come from a series of fields, yes, but I would say some of fields could still be represented. For example, I know that in library field, a lot of study has been done, but there's no trace about it. And that's a pity that information doesn't have to be used. Okay, that's all, folks. I close here.
Okay, thank you very much. It was. Can you see me? It's quite dark. Wait.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm dark. I'm not dark inside, just outside. Okay. Here we are. I was saying, thank you very much. Also, your speech, your presentation was really interesting, really knowledgeable, and also in this case, I have a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, you as a librarian or as a person who studies like how information is and knowledge is spread and stored, whether you think that libraries and bookstores will keep on having the same role that they had until now, that they have had until now, since we live in a world where basically it's really hard to organize and to restrict the spread of knowledge and the spread of articles and information. I mean, what you said about reinforcing the law on what do you say? Sorry.
On copyright issues, you mean?
Exactly. I mean, it's really hard in the world that we've built to enforce the law on privacy, on everything that it's really hard to enforce any law that restricts the sharing of information, that restricts the spread of information. So, do you think that libraries will survive in a world where you can find papers, books almost everywhere for free, even if you in an illegal fashion? But
well, that's a debate that's been going on for a very long time, and there are two questions there. So I'll start from the second, which is, what do we do with copyright laws? Okay, copyright laws must be upheld by institutions such as universities, etc. Definitely. Libraries are not upholding these laws. Laws are and these sort of restrictions are not made or applied by libraries, which don't like them either. But they must be upheld, and who does it is the law. And of course, the law is unlikely to pursue the single researcher. They are much more likely to go hunting down, institutions, libraries, etc. So this is one thing. And of course, I don't think anybody is going to put us into jail because we shared our papers on that drive space. But still, we must be aware of that. The second and most...
I can't hear you anymore.
Libraries.
Now I can.
Definitely, libraries will exist and will even be more needed in a world where there's so much information going around. Because the mission of libraries is twofold. On the one hand, they store information, and they preserve it for the future. And this in the digital world is even more difficult and more necessary than it was in the paper world. I know for a fact, I remember in Holland already 10 years ago, I met some Dutch researchers. There is a central institution which is in charge of preserving all electronic copies of the research papers. And we know how difficult it is also because then you need to change formats to upgrade them, etc., etc. So that is one of the tasks that libraries do. The other task is to organize that information and make it available for the world of scientists. It's very different to search for a piece of paper of research on your institutional repository or just on Google. Even if you find a lot also on Google, I go on Google myself. Then through libraries, you gain access to the resources. As I showed, we can all legally access Science magazine or other magazines through our institutional repositories. So we don't need to break the law, because on the other hand, the law is upheld because there are people who must earn from the job they do, publishers and would be also authors, but I know we don't get paid. Anyway, point is that libraries are someone who can organize information is even more necessary. It's just that the perspective is different. But I think libraries are very behind the times in that they weren't able to communicate this vision, which I hear at all the work conferences of librarians I go to, that libraries are gateways to the wide world of information. They can facilitate researchers who need to find specific information. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I still hear so many people like you say now, what sense do libraries have in a world which is growing digital, that I must admit that probably libraries are not good at communicating that they have changed their vision. Even if when you use the papers you find on in your university repository, you're actually using the library, only not the physical library. The library is more a space. We were talking about community. Your public library is holding fewer and fewer books, but they organize a lot of spaces for people to meet. Mm-hmm. So they are changing, worldwide libraries are changing their vision. Little by little, I think people will realize that. In Italy, maybe a bit later.
For example, one thing I was thinking while you were speaking is that probably libraries could start being the central organizers of the human capital of a community, because of their ability in managing knowledge, in managing information. It's really easy now with all the internet-based technologies, to gather information and gather knowledge that single individual, single agent has in their minds, but that is not written anywhere else. For example, I mean, but library could become the managers of the human capital of a community, because of the stratified knowledge in managing information. I think there will be in many cases there will be a sort of return to oral
investment.
No. I mean, a return to the oral culture. That it's obviously faster, is obviously more efficient, and more efficient in many contexts. For example, if you work in a specific field and you study a subject that is studied by no more than 100 people around the world, it's easier for you to contact those people directly and to start talking with them on Skype or on other platforms, and then publish that just the final outcome of this like continuous process of adjustment of your ideas. So I think that in the future, not most, but a good part of our knowledge will be in the air, but not written in proper papers or books, because of the easiness with which you can communicate with the people that work in your field. And
well, that's a huge storage problem, not an organizational problem. But I would like to say, first of all, one of the sentences of one of my favorite librarian sentences is, only librarians like to search, everyone else likes to find. So actually, you're right, the librarian's job and task is to organize information. We don't, in our job, we don't care so much what is written in, but we are able to discern whether an article, a piece of paper, a piece of literature can be, we are able to evaluate it, even if we don't understand the content, because there are exterior signs. And the library community has developed a lot of these techniques, and also the cataloging itself, if you think of that, well, the fact that all over the world, if you look at a catalog record, you can tell where is the title, where is the name of the author, no matter what language or alphabet it is written into. We maybe don't think about it, but it's a huge task which has been accomplished by the community. Then regarding the collection of single exchanges, etc., let's not forget libraries collect what is published. What you're talking about seems to me more the job of the archivist, and which I heard a lot during my PhD program, because in the digital age, the archivist's work is very different, because they don't have to collect, you know, when somebody, a famous writer, scientist, etc., dies, now what the archivist has got to do is not only collect the pieces of paper, that evidence, but all the emails, the digital data, accounts which are blocked, which things that go lost forever. So there's a lot of these fugitive, actually, conversations going around. And let's say when they get summarized in a library, in a paper, in a published paper book, then they go to the library. Before, when they are, let's say, in their primordial state, they are the archivist's job, because then they just refer to the single person.
Okay.
Yes, but that's one of the things that archivists deal with.
Okay. Thank you very much. Is there any other question? Maybe on YouTube, let me see.
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question, if I can.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, you talked about fake news, which is really popular on the press right now, about Facebook. But we all remember that fake news, it's also related to the mass media system. I think everybody remembers what Colin Powell said about Iraq, the Iraqi war. So just like, trust us, and what they said was not true. So I think that I want to know what you think about it. Sometimes there is too much attention about it, also because for two reasons. First, because I think that people, and this is what emerged about research on virtual communities, people search for persons that reinforce their ideas. So they don't really care about if the information is true or false, in a way. And then also because thinking about the power of the information that we are talking about, just like a post on Facebook can change our mind, means that we are into a deterministic paradigm, which is good. But personally, I disagree. So I think that this is something really more complicated than appears on the news or on the newspapers we are reading these days. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. I think I have been pushed to talk about it also during my PhD, because actually I was interested in another point of view of information. Sorry, I don't know why. But anyway, what you said about biases, etc., is absolutely true. Also, the article, though being so compilatory, etc., made a point of that. Sorry, do you hear my voice?
Yeah, yes, of course, of course.
No, there is not anymore. Okay.
No,
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. No, I could hear my own voice, and so I thought you did as well. Sorry. So what I was saying was, yes, these people are, yeah, the biases, all these implications, which have got to do with community. You are perfectly right. It's a very complicated issue, and it seems to be fashionable now, but though it is fashionable, and I don't like fashionable things in principle, it is still important. And I like to read about it because I think it's got to do in general with the more general issue of information evaluation. And that is connected to my job and my studies and to the food for communities like ours. So, and that's why I think that there is not one solution, because the problem is huge. Because, as you rightly say, if you can change a person's mind with just a post on Facebook, well, that mind was already set there. It didn't need the post to change idea. But actually, I think that there is a great need for the institutions, for the schools and the governments, and the libraries can play a role there in realizing that the ecosystem is actually changing and that new competencies are needed for the new generations in order to use these great opportunities in with sufficient awareness, or they will be just pushed here and there. Because still there's a lot going on online, and the community, you study the community, so maybe you can answer me on that, but I've got the impression that what's happening in the community, the virtual community, the big, huge mass, is pushing people maybe more than it did in the past when we lived in a simply analogic world in the middle of the village with smaller communities. It was enough to change country maybe to find a completely different mood. Maybe now we have this sort of sixth continent, which is the seventh continent, which is yes, the digital world, the virtual world where things happen. And then they are reflected on reality, though, and on the way we see reality. I don't know what you think about it.
Yeah, very interesting. Just to end up this question and replies, I think, yeah, that the mass media system changed. Before it was centralized, and now the system needs to take control over. This is what I think, after all. But anyway, I got your point, and thank you very much for your replies.
Thank you.
Okay. I wanted to mention one thing, if I can, on the thing of fake news, because you both said the thing that in general you cannot change the mind of a person with a single post on Facebook. But I think that's not necessarily what the implication is, but more the problem of having a polarization of views, where the real danger is not that people change their minds, but rather that they're not willing to put their own perspective into question. And I think that is what is mostly been seen, is that people do not change their mind, and that's the problem. You know, the problem is not that they change their mind, but they don't change it anymore. You know, they get so stratified in their own views that it's impossible. It becomes impossible to make them reason. And I think that is sort of the real danger of fake news.
I think you got a point there.
Yes, but I want to underline the fact that for me the problem is that the system before was centralized and now it lost the control. So from your point of view, yeah, it's true, but my attention is on the control on the media system. That's it. But anyway, I got your point. It was very good.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think more than just control is also a problem of accountability, right? And the moment that the information, when fake news was done by media, or well, it's still done by media, but at least you had a culprit. You could say, well, that person was responsible, right? You could say he's the one that did it, and he did it for this particular reason, right? Nowadays, it's very difficult to understand who did something and why. And I think that's sort of what's scarier, because we could all understand when, I don't know, the newspaper owned by Berlusconi said things in favor of Berlusconi, right? But when it is unknown people spreading information for unknown purposes, I think that's what is also causing much of the fear that we see today. But I'm not, of course, most of it is also, part of it is also, the sort of the elites, the media elites, having lost control over the information and the possibility of setting a particular agenda. That is certainly true.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that we are facing a world that is increasingly disorganized and increasingly with an ongoing crisis of identity and of power. So the system of power that governed the Western world until few years ago is quickly becoming inefficient and unable to govern the new phenomena that are related to the birth and the spread of the internet infrastructures. And this is something really scary to me, because when you lose control over a system, you never know how it will develop autonomously. So I think that the fil rouge of all our discussions so far is that we must rethink how societies govern themselves, and how they will deal with all these new phenomena that are stemming from the spread of the internet, that are completely messing up our political and cultural background, and it's really hard to rethink a world that has worked pretty well for like a system that has worked pretty well for 50 years. I would say after the Second World War, the system didn't change much.
Excuse me, don't underestimate the effects television had on populations, because if you read McLuhan today, you discover that he spoke in catastrophical terms of television. I know that the internet is more invasive than television was. That's why I say, yes, people definitely need to redefine and need a new series of competencies and awareness. When I see parents giving their 3-year-old children the cell phone during the dinner at the restaurant so that they can keep quiet, I wonder if those parents are actually aware of these things. Probably they're not. Because this way people grow up and they are not used to talking to others, for example. And then there's a series of other things we could discuss on, but which have got an impact on education. But on the other hand, we need to come to terms with that and to insert this new opportunity in our everyday life. I think really it's just a collective effort that can drive society there.
Yeah, I agree, but the problem is that those organizations that had the aim at that were aimed at educating and guiding people toward common goals are in a completely are living a really huge crisis. For example, when you talk about a common effort, the first word that comes to my mind is a political party. But now we're facing a huge crisis of all the political institutions and all the political infrastructures that help societies to reach common goals and to be coherent in the process of achieving these goals. So even if obviously the situation is not always only black or only white, sometimes I really fear that all these new scenarios that we could easily lose control on these new scenarios, and the consequences could be really bad, because we at the moment we really don't know how to govern and how to rule those people and those institutions, those companies that have the new form of power, that is power over communication and over information. Information is governed by few people, is still governed by few people, is still governed by few companies that are not ruled by any, that they can, because of their immense power, they can even stop respecting the laws and listening to governments and to people.
That's true.
So guys, I think I'll conclude here. Unfortunately, Pietro had to go, so I will conclude it. Good to see you, everybody. This meeting was, to me, it was amazing. I followed all the 3 lectures, all the 3 presentation, and they all gave me a really useful insights. They gave me really useful insights in many fields that have lots to do with collective intelligence. Right now, I think we can conclude. Thank you very much for being part of this forum. I noticed that many people are not showing up. I don't know whether there are some people that are watching the streaming from the same computer, or they're just people that want to watch the meetings on YouTube afterwards. I will send you anyway. As always, we will send you an email with all the links useful that you can use to rewatch today's meeting, and I will also send you the answer that Peter, the guest that we had last week, sent us about a question that someone asked last week about how different disciplines can cooperate or can help developing collective intelligence.
Yeah, it was me. Yes,
it was you. Okay, we asked that question to Peter, and he answered back. So in the email that we are sending you in a couple of hours, you will find the link. Sorry, the answer that Peter sent us. And so next week we'll meet next week, and we'll have an interesting, I hope interesting, presentation about epistemology, epistemic agents and networks, and who knows what, and who knows what, and so on. So the problem of common knowledge and knowledge packages. The conveners will be Marco Antonutti, Davide Valenti, and Laura Carbonai. Hope they are working on their presentations, and as always, we'll ask them to give us some papers that we can read before the presentation and formulate some questions about the topic. Thank you very much again. Hope to see you all next week. I think that the YouTube and the Hangout format is working pretty well, even if some people who are watching us on YouTube sent an email saying that it's pretty hard to interact with the conveners. We'll figure it out next week. Looking at possible solutions. Maybe we'll ask someone to copy and paste the question that people make on YouTube on the Hangout chat. That's all. Thank you very much, and see you next week. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye bye.